Welcome back, Munchers. Last time, we discussed time and space complexity examples. We left off on a challenge problem that I'll be covering today, followed by a new concept we're going to call Big O. Let's get started. We have our function from last time, and it looks really similar to our last example, but the key difference here is that the inner loop only goes up to I. You might assume that it's quadratic from the get-go, and you could be right, but you'd have to explain why that is. Well, let's do it in a simple to understand chart. If I is 0, the inner loop runs from 0 to 0, which is 0 times. If I is 1, the inner loop runs from 0 to 1, which happens 1 time. As you can see, with each iteration, we increase the number of times the loop runs. If I is 2, we run the inner loop twice, and so on. This goes all the way up to n. Therefore, the inner statement actually runs a total of all of these times summed up together, because I goes from 0 to n. Summing them together, we get a sum from 1 to n. There's actually a story behind this, where a famous mathematician in the 1700s, Karl Gauss, was mischievous as a child. He used to get in trouble with the teacher, and as a punishment, she made him add all the numbers from 1 to 100. He wanted to find a formula to do this faster to not have to add them all together by hand. He found that if you reversed the sum and added them together, you would end up with n plus 1 over and over again, as you can see here, happening n times. Adding these together, however, meant you would get 2 times the total sum. So if you divide it by 2, you would end up with n plus 1 times n all over 2. Simplifying this, we get n squared plus n over 2, which, you guessed it, is quadratic. Then what's all this nonsense about Big O that I mentioned? To understand that, we have to revisit the classes of functions I talked about. As we saw, we talked about constant functions, linear functions, and quadratic functions. But there's quite a few more in between, such as logarithmic, cubic, and exponential. We can write these in terms of n. Afterwards, if we plot these on a graph, we can see that these functions grow at different rates. In fact, what we see is that even if a greater function like n cubed is equal to something like n, when n is at 1, if you reach a large enough n, you'll find that because the rate of growth of n cubed is much faster, any linear function, whether that's n, 2n, 3n, or even 9000n, will still eventually be overtaken. Considering this, computer scientists took a long look at these classes of functions and thought, what if we ran an algorithm and looked at its worst-case scenario? We could then take the exact function that it runs at. Let's say we had a hypothetical function that ran at 900n cubed. We could then find the upper bound of this function. The upper bound of a function is any function that, when multiplied with a constant, would be greater than or equal to the original function. So if we take n cubed and multiply it with, let's say, a constant 901, the result is greater than or equal to 900n cubed. We could have picked any function here that works, such as n to the 4th, n to the 5th, 2 to the n, and so on. They all upper bound 900n cubed. But really, what computer scientists found useful is to find the closest function to which we hit the upper bound with a constant multiplied. This keeps the worst-case scenario manageable. For instance, you could say the length of your bed is smaller than the Earth's radius, because the Earth is a valid upper bound to your bed. But it wouldn't be a useful comparison because that wouldn't give a person a good idea of what your bed size would be. After all, it could be as long as a football field and still meet the criteria. It would be a lot more reasonable to say your bed is shorter than 2 meters or 6.5 feet, which is a lot closer in size. The closest function, when multiplied by a constant that works as an upper bound to 900n cubed, is n cubed itself. The programmers wanting to name this upper bound settled on naming it Big O. A common misconception to clear up here: programmers that have worked with Big O before assume that Big O automatically means the worst case. This is not true. You could find the Big O of the best case. Big O simply means the upper bound of a function, and the most useful of said upper bound, like I mentioned before, is when you find the closest function that satisfies it. Then why do people interchange those terms? The reason is, algorithms are always preparing for the worst. Since we seem to analyze the worst case in 99% of scenarios, we choose to find the upper bound of those scenarios. Seeing that we use Big O every time we use the worst case, people have misunderstood them to be one and the same. Programmers have also determined conventions for the lower bound and average bound, and yes, they're likely to be exactly as you'd expect. However, for the purposes of what need to be covered in our knowledge base of DSAs, we don't have to discuss them. As we progress in the future, and since most input is declared with the usage of the variable n, we're going to refer to time and space using Big O, replacing each of the different types of functions we have with our newly understood Big O notation. We can call constant functions Big O of 1, logarithmic functions Big O of log of n, linear functions Big O of n, quadratic functions Big O of n squared, cubic functions Big O of n cubed, and so on. And that's it for today. Comment down below on what you learned about Big O. On that note, thanks for watching. If you liked what you saw here, give it a thumbs up, share it with your friends, subscribe, and hit the notification bell so that you know when the next one's coming. See you next time.